Okay, so we're going to start. Today I'm talking. Somebody asked the question, did Joe know biomechanics? So, when we look at his writings, he doesn't really talk about biomechanics because as a place of study, it used to be called kinesiology. And that was first coined in like the 1800s, mid-1800s, kinesiology. And it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that biomechanics became its own like specialty and way of studying and profession and something that somebody could get a degree in, per se. It wasn't really done before, so if that wasn't until like the 60s and the 70s. So right at the end of his life. So Joe really didn't write about biomechanics, but when you think about, what it is, it's the study of animal movement, right, to a certain degree using mathematics. And if you look at the history, what's this? Let me see. I have it written down here. The person's name is Giovanni Alfonso Borelli. I think I'm saying that right. I could be wrong. And he first wrote a book about the animal, the science of animal movement, and we're animals, so that was part of it. He looked at animals and he looked at humans, and what did Joe do? Joe looked at animals and he looked at humans and figured out, how to teach them how to, exercise and return to life and move. But, Mr. Borelli did that in the 1600s. So, was it available for Joe? Did he have that book? We don't know. I doubt it because it's a hard book to get. And nowadays you can get it because you have all these publishers who publish old books that are in the public domain, and they'll just publish them and put them out there, and you can buy them for $20 or $30, something like that. So, but in Joe's day, that wasn't really how it worked. And a book from the 1600s is not something that you would find in, bookstores, and probably not even too many used bookstores. There are a few that are out there, but again, if it was printed in the 1600s, it was also probably worth a fair amount of money. I mean, nowadays those books are, $500 to $500 or more, things like that. Sometimes, like, some of the old anatomy books are tens of thousands of dollars, because they're that's how old they are and rare they are. So something to think about. So did Joe understand biomechanics? Did he do biomechanics? And again, yes, in the sense of looking at animal movement and function, he did. Did he do the math? I don't think so. It's not written anywhere. I don't see it. Excuse me, in any of his writings. So I don't think that was something that he necessarily focused on. But we also know that, anatomy, kinesiology, that was taught as part of any training in, the sciences, if you were going to be medical or allied med and things like that. And the German and Swedish gymnastics and exercise movements, that was part of it, much more in Sweden, because the person who, I have that too, the medical gymnast and kinesiologist Carl August Georgi, he basically created and coined the new international word kinesiology in 1854. So these things were studied way before, but then different names came about and they started to provide names, but the way of thinking and studying was there way before Joe. And was he exposed to it? We don't know for sure, but what did he do? He looked at the same thing that they did. What did these people do? It wasn't like there was something that they could read, and if he didn't have the books, he studied people and animals and started to figure out how they moved and functioned, and started to use his system to train that with the springs and the apparatus that he invented. So that's a little bit different. And, one of the things that I always talk about in my when I do the teacher training, and Ramona didn't really talk about it. She did a little bit because it's the box, right? So they talk about the body, the body being the box, right? So the box is what? It's within the box, right? Because every apparatus is relatively square, right? Just like everybody's body is relatively square, okay? We have a squareness to us, or a balance to us, and it's deviations and variations all over the place. And when you look at apparatus today, that's changed a lot too, so there's even that. So it's like, can you teach Joe's work on any apparatus today? I don't think so. Some people say, oh, I can do anything, but it makes it very difficult when you've deviated so far away from what he had, to say that you can teach the same thing and get the same results. You can think, maybe, I've not seen any science or anything like that relates to that and shows us that there is something that shows us that you can use any apparatus and get the same results that Joe claimed and did for 40 some years, 50 years. So that being said, if you look at the apparatus, it's all square. I mean, so when you lie a body on a Cadillac or on a reformer, or put it, standing on a ladder barrel or on a spine corrector lying down, there's a squareness, right, to the apparatus, and it doesn't deviate, right? So when you lie somebody down, you can see where they lie on it. So what do we do as teachers? We align them within the alignment, right? So it's something that we can think about, right? And how to do that. How do we teach a way that is, I'm trying to think the best way to talk about it. Teach in a way that allows us to see the imbalances or the deviations or the movement habit patterns that people have from whatever their environment and their history is, and their genetics, right? And so the things that we can change, the things that we can't change, and the apparatus allows us to get the best balance within the imbalance for those individuals, and best box within the box, right? So you're in the box and you're thinking outside the box, which is still within the box, which is the apparatus, right? There's two squares that we're looking at. We're looking at two different things and trying to see the relationships and the variations and the deviations that one has compared to the one that doesn't have that, right? Because those don't change. Well, except for nowadays we have people changing the apparatus quite a bit. So that's a possibility that you can, and something new maybe come out of that at some point. I don't know. I'd like to, there'd have to be a lot of research done to see if, one, take Joe's work and the way he taught it on his apparatus, and then do, other work, other exercises made up, change, different, and other apparatus, and say, okay, well, if we do this, this is how bodies respond, and you can't do it with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. You need to do hundreds to thousands. And then you do the same thing with that, and then you can do comparisons and say, well, what are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? What changes happen? What changes don't happen, for better or for worse, right? Because we're plastic to the end. The body changes when you stress it. It just does. And the difference is we're plastic to the end in a good way or in a bad way. Right? We can go either way. Because, when you sit poorly and you do all these things that we do for decades and decades and decades, there's changes that happen in the body, and it's seen over time. And we can see it as people get older, and with gravity and everything else. So that was one of Joe's philosophies, is to try to fight that and do something different, right? So that's something to think about. And it's really, when we look at function, Joe, functional exercise is something that's relatively new in the last maybe 15, 20 years at the most, I think. And there's is there a functional anatomy? And when we look at, movement and function, it's about anatomy. It's, like, what is biomechanics? Biomechanics is looking at human movement and trying to understand it better. And that's what we want to think about doing is, what does science do? It explains things in life for us. And so what's the functional aspect of Pilates? Is there a functional, biomechanics? And I think that when you look at that in relationship to what Joe taught, it is functional. And it is, there are relationships, and it is biomechanics, because guess what? What did he do? He did the same thing as far as looking at animals in movement and trying to figure out, what's the best way to get the most functional relationships and changes that allow us to, as he said, return to life. And really, to me, it's either return to life or maintain. I have a chart when I teach in it. It's life with Pilates and life without Pilates. And life with Pilates, you stay functional and then you die. And life without Pilates, what we see quite often is that you end up where you started, right? So where do you start? You start with somebody feeding you, bathing you, clothing you, helping you do everything. Well, there's a lot of people at the end. Guess what? They need somebody to help them do all those other things, And Joe's philosophy was, you're able to do what you did at 20 at whatever age you are, and then you die, right? And so you go on, and then at the end, that's what happens. And to me, that's that's related to quality of life and how we do what we do in the long term. And again, can you start that at any time? I think you can, because the body's plastic to the end. So you can start to do things, and the body will change if you stress it, right? Whether it's the heart, the muscles, the bones, all those things. So the things that we lose due to inactivity, the things that we lose due to the sitting postures that are for decades and 8 to 10 hours a day, the drawbacks that the body does. Our bodies were not designed for that way of living, right? It's just not how we were designed. We were designed to move and function in our environment all the time. Now that we have our changes with technology and everything else, and the inventions, the creative spirit of the mind, and what people have come up with, including Joe, for exercise and for other things, we lose a lot of that aspect, right? So one of the things that I think that we can look at is that with Joe understanding the body and the mechanics of the body and how we learn to move, and that's what he integrated into his system, that there is a functional anatomy and a functional biomechanics in Pilates, because that's what he was paying attention to and looking at and focused on. Did he do the math? Did he analyze it and look at the angles and all that kind of stuff? It doesn't appear that he did. Okay, so as a scientist or a mathematician, that's not what Joe did. But as a practical, functional aspect, that's definitely what he did, and that's what his system is based on. So I think that that when we look at that, that's something to consider, right? Because if you're doing it Joe's way, Joe's contrology, what are we doing? We're doing something that he spent a lifetime developing, tweaking, fine-tuning, and analyzing, and also looking at the results and seeing the changes that would happen with his body and with his clients' bodies. And again, when we look at his principles, right? So Joe had one principle. Basically, I mean, it's a little. I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically said his principle was do the exercises the way I say to do the exercises, pretty much. Okay, and we know that there's the other Pilates principles that came from Gail Eisen and Philip Friedman from the 80s, or maybe the late 70s. The book was published in, I think, 1980, so maybe the late 70s. And they were students of Ramana, and Ramana liked it, and she approved of it. And so when we did the teacher training and the manuals, and all the classical people who got certified and trained, that's the principles that they were included in the manual and in the book. But they're in different systems have different principles. Joe's was just do the exercise pretty much the way I say to do it. And Gail Eisen and Philip Friedman's principles are not bad principles. They try to explain what and give it something that you could give a terminology to, right? For the exercise. But biomechanics has its own principles. And again, if you read different people, they may say different things. But I'm looking at the one I like is there's 7 principles. I'm going to read them to you. And there is some correlation to Pilates, right? Because if we look at it, the principles of biomechanics, one is stability. Well, that's a foundation in Pilates. Ramon always talked about stability, before mobility. That's Pilates. And why? Because most people, if you're unstable, that's where injuries happen. When you don't have control and you are unstable, that's how people get injured all the time. So the more stable you are and the more in control, right? So contrology, the less likely you're going to have injuries and problems. So stability is one of the principles. So I would, that's when you look at Pilates, there's something that we do all the time. Maximum effort, right? Well, when we look at Joe, he's not like hanging out like this. There's always effort. I don't know if it's always maximum, but I think that when he did his exercises, he did, the effort, all the time, and everything's always working. It's full body exercise. It's never just one muscle or one muscle group or one joint. I don't think anywhere in the system. Okay, even when he's doing his finger exercises, he's sitting and he's doing, more than one joint and more than one muscle. It's related to stability. It's if you look at to be able to do fine motor control, what do you have to have? You have to have proximal stability, right? I can't lift my arm and do something here if I don't have something going on here. This is working to allow this to work. So that's always happening, right? Then there's maximum velocity. So I guess, you look at it, velocity and the speed and how things are done. And Joe, we see that he definitely plays with the velocity in a way of movement and breath and different things, because when you breathe, what's the velocity? I mean, you're pushing the air out, you're pulling the air in. That's related to velocity. So maximum, he's trying to get you to use your full breath in a few places. So I would consider that, maximum. I mean, I guess maybe, you could strain it and do even more, but for life relationships, I don't think so. I think that's basic, simple things. When we're looking at what's available for life, the maximum that most people are going to do in life, he tries to achieve that. And then it's impulse, right? So where's the impulse? Where's it start? Where do things start? I talked about this, last week about like where does it start? Where does Pilates start? And it starts in the mind, right? It's you have to want to do something, and what controls everything is the mind. What controls the muscles is the mind. The muscle organ is controlled by the neural organs, right? And so everything's interconnected. And if that's the case, then, the impulse. So there's an impulse always. And where does it come from? Okay. And then what's the reaction? There's always a reaction to the impulse, to the movement, to the, the things that are happening. So that's something to think about as well. There's always that process that has to happen in Pilates. And then another principle is torque. And, when I look at torque as, torque is usually some sort of a twist or strain. And when we look at that, when we look at developmental and we look at how we're progressing, a lot of the injuries that happen, I see that, as a PT that I've seen over my career and 40 years work with dancers who have a lot of torque in what they do dance-wise. It's mostly related to a shearing force and rotations and side bendings and some flexion extension, and a lot of times it's combinations. And so when we look at what Pilates does, it helps us progressively learn how to control in the simple planes to the more complicated, right? And then into the much more dynamic of multiple planes working at the same time in different functions. So when we look at basic, intermediate, advanced, and super advanced exercises, we see that progression. So that's part of it as well. All right. And then it talks about angular momentum. That's another principle of biomechanics. Well, we have all these things happen in the body all the time. And so they what's happened is, they're trying to analyze it with math. They're trying to analyze it with vectors and geometry and all the different things that you do in math, and look at it and then try to transpose that into what we do in real life. But Joe understood those principles. Maybe he didn't use that terminology and he didn't do all those things to that level, but he understood the basic foundations of that and developed his system based on that. So I think that, when you say the question was, did Joe know biomechanics? He didn't know it the way it's taught today. And if you get a book on biomechanics, it's a lot of math. It's a lot of vectors. It's a lot of things that you have to do to understand and help you analyze what we do in life and relationship, because mechanics was machines and bio is life. It's the combination of life and mechanics, right? So biomechanics and looking at the body as a machine, but it's much more dynamic than at most machines. Okay, because usually when we see machines made, what do? They want to put it on an assembly line and they want to get them as close to as possible. But we also know that machines are very much like bodies, because if you are a Pilates student and you've gone to a place where they have multiple apparatus, multiple reformers, do you have your favorite? Why is that one favorite and why are they not all the same? Because every machine, every apparatus has a slight variation difference, no matter if the same person's making it. It's on an assembly line. That's why some cars are lemons and some aren't. There's always these things that can happen. So when we look at that, that's something that is related to function, in the sense that where are we going with trying to change our bodies on apparatus, okay? But now what's happening is we're seeing real changes happening. There's the slight variations within the same apparatus that's always supposedly made the same way. I mean, a perfect example is, this past fall in September, we at our Pilates at the Pillow, we did it on the reformer, and we had apparatus, Joe's original clawfoot. We had the junior reformer. We had a number of different Gratz, reformers from different time periods, and there's differences and the variations and this, different things happen. So even within the same manufacturer, there are some changes, but the standard was pretty much, the length, the width, those are basically very similar, but there were still some changes depending on the apparatus that you were talking about. Nowadays, though, they're changing the width, they're changing the length, they're changing the resistance, the spring resistance, all these different things. That's not something Joe really, he started with 7 and he went to 4. So yeah, did he have more at one point? Sure. But he went to 4 and he stayed with 4 from the time he got, from the time he got to the U.S. until he died. I mean, we know in Germany, because I have a blueprint, and there were 7 springs. So we know that he originally had 7, but he changed it to 4. And then he didn't change it, and the springs stayed the same. Corolla talked about it. We know that Joe did it. And when I got the reformer in Beckett, which was his original, it had 4 of the springs that were all the same resistance. So that there is something to that as well. Okay, now there's lots of changes. Okay, so I'm sort of going all over the place. A little bit of tangents, but that's okay. So if anybody has a question, you can ask it. If you have any other questions that you would like me to do for my AMAP on Fridays, please DM me, and I will try to answer questions for you, just like this one, and give you some insight that I know that I have from almost 40 years, and from my studies and as a PT and and a lot of other things as well, and trying to give you some insight on what Joe did and why, and whether he was doing things that are behind the times or ahead of the times. He always said he was ahead of his time, and I see all the time, people saying, it's based on science, like it's somehow that's new and it's going to be better than what Joe did. But Joe, what is science? Science explains life. Well, Joe understood, the body and how it moved and it functioned. What's the best advice for a new Pilates instructor? Well, my best advice for a new Pilates instructor is know what you're teaching. So study it and practice it. And you don't know what you're teaching unless you do it. You have to practice Pilates all the time so that you get it in your body and you know what you're doing, so that when you go to teach somebody, you're not just giving an exercise. You're giving an understanding of an exercise that you have from your impulse, your understanding, your relationships to the apparatus, your practice, and when you've had troubles, how did you get around it? Because intuition is just basic, a lot of history, right? So somebody goes, how did you know that? Well, you knew it because you've experienced it yourself, or in your teaching you've experienced it, and then you paid attention and you remembered. And so the next time you get, somebody similar, because we're all different, but we're all the same, right? So if we're all different and we're all the same, there's a lot of similarities that happen. And there's similarities in psychology, there's similarities in anatomy, there's similarities in input, output, all the variables of the human body. And what can we do as teachers? We have to practice what we do. And again, if you want to get what Joe got, you got to study what Joe taught, right? Do the exercises the way I say to do them. And there's, and I don't know where you're trained, but there's so many trainings out there, and people are, Pilates and classical Pilates are generic terms. So anybody can use the term and say, I'm teaching you Pilates. I'm teaching you classical Pilates. And it could be nothing that Joe taught or nothing that Ramana taught. And Ramana taught mostly what Joe taught. So, and is it bad? I don't know. I have no idea if everything that's out there being taught. I can tell you that I see some things on social media that people are doing for clicks that are definitely dangerous, and I think could be very, detrimental if not done properly, or if somebody tried to do it and they weren't strong enough and didn't have, what they needed to be able to do that exercise, they could injure themselves, they could fall. There's lots of things that I see that are dangerous today. So, as a new teacher, study, basic, right? That's what you need to do. You need your basics, and that's the foundation. And that's like in anything, right? If you're learning to read, what are your basics? Your ABCs, your alphabet. Well, in Pilates, there's your ABCs, your basic exercises. And then you have your intermediate. And intermediate's part of what you had in basic. And then when you get to advanced, advanced has basic and intermediate parts that you do in advanced. But if you try to do advanced and you don't have the basic and the intermediate, you could have real problems because you don't have the control. So if you don't have control, what do? A lot of times when you don't have control, that's how you get injured. So those are the things, most Pilates teachers get injured because when they're training, again, I have to say something different, because nowadays you can get online training, right? No hands-on, no touch, no feel. You don't have to do lots of hours or anything else like that, and you get a certificate. Well, that's different. But with the way Joe taught, Ramana taught, you had to spend time when you were ready. Then they put you in and had you work with clients, and it was a progression, and it was a way to go. So if that's the case, that's something that you need to get. So, but I think most Pilates teachers, right, they have to, when you're first starting, you really need to understand how to take somebody through a program and develop it over time. And the body doesn't change like that. You can't do an exercise and go, okay, now I'm strong. It takes weeks or months to gain that strength. It takes a week or two to lose it if you stop doing it. So there's lots of things, that happen. Okay. So one of the things that you can think about is how do you develop that? So as a teacher, you need to have the practice in your own body. You need the hands-on. You need to, to do those sequencings, and then, have other teachers that you can talk with, because, mentorship is important, and you need people who have the experience. And so a lot of times it's continuing to take classes with teachers, as a teacher. I work with Elaine Ewan, who's been teaching over 20 some years, and she still takes class weekly with other teachers, because that helps her become a better teacher. So those are the things that I would suggest as a new teacher. All right. All right. So I teach class on Tuesdays. I have at 12:30. It's not a Pilates class. It's called Balanceology. It's for balance control and understanding. I take it a little bit farther than Pilates does for balance, so that what you can, because it's the first thing, the last thing we gain, it's the first thing we lose, right? So that's something that I've added to it, and it all came out of my teaching at Jacob's Pillow, the mat at Jacob's Pillow, because the mat's 34 exercises and it was an hour class, so it was always extra time. So then I would have people stand up and do some balance work, and we know Joe did a little bit of that, so I've increased it. And then at 1 o'clock on Tuesdays, I teach the resistor class, which is arm springs, leg springs, mostly arm springs, some leg springs. You don't need a resistor to do it. You can have a Cadillac, a wall unit, anything that you can attach springs to, legs, arm springs, at shoulder height, and a little lower for your leg springs to be able to do the workout. And that's at 1 o'clock on Tuesdays. So, and you can register at my Linktree at Linktree /Sean_Gallagher, and you can sign up there if you're interested. Okay. All right. So thanks for joining me, and I will. And again, if you know anybody that likes this, or you like this and you think other people would like it, please tell them about it. Our YouTube channel, the Pilates Source YouTube channel, I post all of my AMAPs on there, plus lots of other history stuff. Elaine Ewing's got different things for apparatus. We have lots of information on the YouTube channel if you're interested in actual factual history and understanding of Pilates. So this will also be there. I usually put it in within, I have some time today, so I'll probably do it pretty soon after this is over. But you can also look at all the other ones as well. Okay? So thanks for joining me, and I will see you all next week. And again, if you have a question, DM me, and I will add it to the list. All right, thank you all for joining. Bye.